Okay, so this is our response to the Aponte video, specifically from a structural therapy lens.
Yes. So the first question is, based on the Aponte video, describe how the structure of Melanie's family of origin, its racial, ethnic, religious, gender, and or socioeconomic backgrounds impacts their lives related to the problems Melanie, the daughter, is experiencing. All right.
I can start with like one specific thing that is very clear throughout the video is that David is a new person who's brought into their lives, who is also going to be a very important person as like a step parent and a parental figure, but clearly is like still new to the U.S., new to finding jobs. So being like that causing harder to attain like finances, harder to attain stability, and harder to then like have like stable housing that remains, that Melanie can be a more frequent part of. And obviously like Lori's
still like stepping into the role.
Yeah,
it was really unclear for like, so what you're talking about, like cultural, financial, like
Yeah,
the whole
we don't know
dynamic.
like
So many
linguistics.
different, like, yeah, right.
He speaks a little bit of English, but we don't know how much. We don't know if the family speaks Spanish. It kind of sounded like they don't,
but also like being primarily Spanish speaking is going to affect his ability to get a job.
Yeah, and also communicate with Melanie and communicate with Lori.
Yeah, so that's like one part, but obviously David is not even like a central role to the family, so there's even more beyond that, but that was one thing that I noticed as a pretty major point.
Yeah. Another thing to take into account is their socioeconomic background. So they're living at the poverty line or somewhere around there, and Lori has a hard time keeping a job. They are financially unstable, and because of that, she has to rely on her parents, her mom and her grandmother, to take care of Melanie a lot of the time. But then grandma is still working most of the time, so Melanie ends up spending most of her time with great grandmother. So already we have like at least 3 plus David, so 4 different adults in Melanie's life that are potential parental figures. So there's a lot of people involved. Another aspect.
I was just considering that, like, there was this thing I was saying that I kind of disagreed with what he was sharing, that I see like as this cultural perspective, and I could have this wrong, this might be an assumption, but it actually seems normal, from what I understand from a lot of Hispanic culture, that the grandmas are parenting the child, and in the way he discusses it, it's like not normal, but what's not normal is the culture that they're living in and trying to integrate in, and like having to deal with socioeconomic issues and language barriers. And that may, to me, when I was watching it, that's what I saw was a lot more I mean, it's more complex than that, but a lot of my understanding of like cultures is that the grandparents in the community are like, that's a normal part, that they end up raising the grandchild a lot. And so the way he languaged it made me, like, he was calling them all moms, and I was saying, actually, I think some of those roles are pretty traditional grandparenting roles. And yeah, like, there needed to be more cohesion around that, but that may be because they're in separation. Normally, in healthy community, like in most of like history, they would have all been living together. So it's like navigating this world, this complicated world. And yeah, anyways, does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, and then the little girl, I guess something else I like really, actually I felt it somatically when I was watching it. So in the beginning, when he's trying to talk to a little girl and she freezes, do you guys remember that? I felt that. Yeah, because so just like more personal info, my granddaughter does that, and I know what it is and I know what's going on, and I've witnessed people do it, but when a little person does it, I could actually feel it, and it made me respond to like, oh, and then her what you would call possuming, which is like that fight or flight response where she's disassociating, shutting down. And he did talk about her being sleepy, but it was more than that. She was possuming. Have you heard that term before? Okay, so that's like the when I'm not sure what terms we're using, like if we have a word for it yet in our class, but it's when the part of the nervous system that's like the dorsal vagal parasympathetic nervous system in our fight or flight response is when there's a massive shock that is too much for us to process. And so an animal would just, like, if it got caught by a lion, like a deer, or like they limp, they die. They literally die to protect themselves. And then all of a sudden, like, it goes away, they'll get up and jump and run, flight. And so that's called
Awesome.
one of the words is called possuming, because possums do
Like
that.
they play dead.
Yeah, they play dead. Yeah. And so I just, like, I saw the little girl doing that, and he spoke to it, I think, and also, tried engaging her to see if she would come. Yeah, it was just, it was an interesting dynamic to watch. And I could feel it in my whole being of, like, oh, this little girl.
She's having like a
Yeah.
full like sensory
Right. Yeah,
moment
of like, so, and I just thought he did really good, like, with using humor too, to, like, gentle humor to, like, just connect and make it talk about this heavy stuff.
Well, that's what I kind of have something going off of that, is that I wonder if using the term moms was a way for him to kind of like reframe their identities for Melanie, as opposed to talking about it from like a cultural perspective in that regard. Just being like, because it felt like when he said that, he was often directing it at Melanie, like, did you know you have 3 moms? You know what I mean? Like, trying to be like, did you know that you have 3 like of these parental figures that generally have to do with like caring and loving and supporting? But I also recognize that, like, clearly Lori is like, if it is, because they don't really dig into whether or not that's like in their family culture history of like having
we also know
having
that dad
family.
is Hispanic, but mom is not. The grandma and grandpa.
Dad is
Grandpa
Mexican,
has like
Right.
Hispanic roots, but mom is not of Hispanic origin.
But that's to say that, like, if it is community living that's been in their cultural history and like having multi-generational homes, you can tell that Lori is still fighting to try to like engage in the like American individualization culture of like, well, but I have to get on my own feet. I have to get my own job that can take care of the family. I have to get my own house that like the kids can come to, and like it's trying to like fight that, and that could really be causing a lot of this friction, as well as like you know, and I think he supports that, right? He supports like, okay, well, if you are going to have partially a multi-generational family, and if you're going to keep working toward having your individualism, clearly Melanie already has these established relationships, so how can you be like what did he say? He called her like it's like a corporation of parents.
He said the corporation of parents. He said that she's the ambassador.
Yeah.
Which is
like the chair.
Actually, like the way that he was kind of creating like that cohesive. But he was
so
also
he's joining.
making it
Goes into number 3, but
so we can come back.
So
to this
we
too.
can come back to it. But just before, yes, very valid. Is there any other like
I want to go back though.
Racial, ethnic, religious, gender, socioeconomic backgrounds? I thought one important thing to recognize is that they have a history of alcoholism. Dad's an alcoholic, or grandpa is an alcoholic, brother's an alcoholic. Lori was raised in an alcoholic family. Grandmother used to be an alcoholic. So regardless of her sobriety or whatnot, that energy is still there, and it becomes very apparent later when Aponte is talking mostly with Lori of how much trauma that's caused her, and how much that kind of inconsistency and uncertainty affected her and makes her want to like hold on for control, which then could trickle down to like the confusion that Melanie feels and the overwhelm of feelings and emotions leading her to cry or whatnot. So.
Yeah. Oh, and I also noticed, I mean, just based on the structure of their family, is when it comes to like gender roles, there's not a lot of active male presence or like masculine presence in the space, and like the one person who seems maybe more consistent being David, because they don't really talk about how, she does see her dad on the weekends.
But we don't know much
really know
about
what that
him.
relationship is like. But
Melanie's
I
dad,
would say
not Lori's dad.
that is still a consistent relationship.
Yeah.
She's going every weekend. But the fact that like the relationship we're seeing in this room with David, like David's very clearly like doesn't feel like a part of it.
His body language in the beginning is this, and then his body language in the beginning is like this, and then he engages him like in his first like connection. He engages him with a little bit of humor, I remember, and he actually readjusts, opens his arms, and just crosses his legs, which actually is a more open posture. So his posture is very much like, I'm present and I'm here and I'm engaged, but I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then over the time as he gets engaged, his posture shifts, and I literally starts opening up. But he does respond with great eye contact right from the get-go. So he's very like, I'm here and I'm open and I want to do this.
Yeah.
But my point about, which is also really cool, but my interest in that is what is the effect of like mostly feminine input on Melanie's like being raised,
Like
and
strong.
what it seems like to have somebody in the space who, without being like given the opportunity to speak, which it sounds like probably isn't offered very often to David, like what that's like to see that like masculine or like father type figure as like being more reserved and more closed off. I'm just curious how that affects. I don't actually know that gets
I don't think
recognized,
no.
so that could come back in the end to be like maybe a theme that I would consider recognizing that's not really super talked about. But anyway, we can get back to that.
And that might be something that you would need to bring Melanie's dad into the space to really discuss.
That's what
too.
I would think
To
too.
like
Yeah,
talk to
it
David
was-
and Melanie's dad, the male figures in her life.
Yeah.
But that might be something that Lori would have to kind of resolve on her own first with her own father issues
Yeah.
in order to be receptive to that. But I don't know. That again, that's another thing that you could dive into.
Yeah.
But it's a good the family of origin context to recognize. So we can move on. I think we should describe the two interventions we saw first, and then we can talk about what we would add and where that would look.
That sounds good to me.
So 2 interventions that we saw. The first one that's the most obvious is the joining. Aponte does a really good job at validating Lori's feelings of feeling like she has so much that she has to take on all by herself. He validates David's feelings, he validates Melanie's, everyone's feelings. He does a good job at validating and then also providing some insight, a different perspective of viewing the challenges that they face and trying to like change the pattern, which is a very structural therapeutic technique.
He does a good job in engaging Lori like on the same lines and letting her know that like holding a space for her to have all her experiences of wanting to come in when she's hardly there. She's only there on the weekends and like direct things.
Yeah.
And saying, she's been doing homework all day. She should be. That was one of their conflicts. She's been at school. She should be able to go play. So he validates her by being like, oh well, I would do the same thing with my children.
Yeah.
And you're not there, so that's really confusing for her and causing this dissonance. And then he goes on to kind of guide her into saying, you can be the ambassador. You can connect with them about that. And then when you're all on the same page, share it with Melanie. So he just is a really good, I was very impressed with his ability to acknowledge her and say, and this bigger perspective.
Yeah.
So yes, and I absolutely agree. And I'm on the same page with him. Like, of course, for me, of course, your kids should go out and play before they do schoolwork, and it's like, so yeah, I just thought it was a very like clear way. It was like gentle, but very clear.
Mm-hmm. And he said things like, I wrote down, being hard is how you protect yourself from your pain. Mm-hmm. So like acknowledging the behavior that she uses towards Melanie and her family, which can be presenting as hard, but also acknowledging that there's a reason behind why she does what she does, so that she doesn't feel othered or like weird or kind of attacked.
Can we call some of that also reframing negativity in a way that is like recognizing like you're seeing yourself as this like bad, mean, aggressive person, but really what you're doing is you're fighting for control because of a history that you've had.
Yeah.
And because of a thing that we need to, you might need to now reframe and recognize or approach differently than you had been seeing it before. And it's not because you're bad, it's because something, you live a different life than what is normal.
Yeah.
Right?
Whatever.
Because that's not a thing. But like it's okay that you're there, and it's okay that you're feeling bad because it is hard, but you aren't inherently bad. And it can be worked through. And so I think like
so that's
reframing
another-
negativity is an approach that he takes in particular with Lori, because I think and even when he's talking to the like social worker after, he kind of makes a note where he's like, you know, it's gonna be hard. She's not gonna want to open up because she has these feelings of like hardness and this
Protection.
Protection,
wanting to control everything.
But it all is coming from a place of like really, really caring and really wanting to try so hard. You know, so I think that's an interesting way that he kind of reframes that negativity, specifically in regards to Lori, how she thinks about her emotions and herself.
So that was 2. I think also, really quick, he also did de-triangulation, specifically with taking Melanie out of the context. Like he addressed her and he talked to her at the beginning, but then shifted the conversation to focus more on Lori and Grandma and David and the adults in the room, which kind of took the pressure off of Melanie, and the focus changed, which I thought was very well done.
It was very well done in a way that like allowed reception from everybody, as opposed to just like, oh, so you're gonna ignore Melanie's problem? Because really, it wasn't necessarily a Melanie problem, right? It's a
Trickle down.
family relationship problem.
Yeah. And I can't remember if it was ever directly addressed. You can help remind me, but going back to the cultural thing, like our culture, as Lori is like trying to be like part of the Western culture and do all these things, right? All this pressure in our culture, and I've experienced this and I've witnessed it. As moms we take responsibility for everything, and like we're trying as mothers to do everything. Like it's my fault. I have to do everything perfect. Everybody thinks it's my fault. They're gonna let me know it's my fault, and so. Like he helps shift the role where she still like has power, but is like taking some of that pressure off of being a mom, because in our minds as a mom, it's like I have to do all, be all. Like there's so much pressure, so much like I'll never ever be able, like literally impossible to live up to that. And she's clearly doing that too. Like, oh, I'm supposed to be all this and everything for everyone, and so it's like, then I have to take control. I have to be in control. And I'm so on the edge of everything that if it's not in control anymore, it's my fault. And everybody's happy to let me know it's my fault too.
That's like reframing.
Right.
Does really well. Organically.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So the last part is during a therapy session. A therapist can choose many themes to explore. We talked about some. If you were the therapist, what other structural theme might you have emphasized for this family, other than the ones that Aponte followed? Hypothesize where you believe this theme might have taken the session. Use structural language.
Well, I'll go ahead and give the example that I already kind of brought up, which is focusing on also like what sort of father type figures are in the relationship with Melanie, and what their relationship is with Lori and the grandmas, especially in terms of like they really are focusing on like everybody coming to an agreement, but they specifically talked about like bringing, you know, all of the grandmas and like moms into the space for one, and then bringing Lori and David in for a session so they can agree. But then there's also what about David and Dad, you know, because they did mention that those. David was like, yeah, we talked to him, you know, like they said like that they talked, so it didn't sound like it was a necessarily, maybe not like an enjoyable conversation, but not a strenuous one either maybe, but bringing just those people into the space, maybe even without Lori if that feels comfortable, to say like, okay, let's get us on the same page. Maybe that's not quite comfortable to bring an ex-husband and a current husband into a space together. I'm not sure, but
well, I think also even before that, you could kind of see how Melanie, the theme of like, what does Melanie feel about her parents not being together, or a theme of David as this new member of the family. Like, what does she view? How does she think about David and who he is? And another thing that they could discuss is like, where's the sister? We know that there's a younger sister somewhere, but we don't know what's going on with her.
We know a little bit. We know younger sister stays with mom, stays with Lori.
But like, does that impact Melanie? Like, does she feel kind of like othered, or like, oh, mom doesn't spend enough time with me?
Like, there's like that coalition of like mom, David, and Contessa are like a coalition, and then like grandma, great grandma, and Melanie are like in this. So it almost feels like there's these like separate things that are still together, right? 'Cause
Yeah.
they're all still family, but
And they switch around unexpectedly
Yeah.
a little bit.
so what would it be like to identify those and then also bringing in the peripherals of
Yeah. So if we were gonna incorporate one of those themes, where do we think it would be in the conversation?
or like where would it lead the
Yeah.
Session.
Where would it lead?
What are we talking about incorporating specifically?
I mean, what I gained from that question, or like what comes to mind from that question for me, is like where would it lead the session? I think would lead to giving more alternatives in regards to like he already touches on discussing like Lori's relationships with like the men in her life, but doesn't go that deeper into it with specifically her like dad, brother, and ex-husbands. And so if they were to discuss more of like Melanie's father figures and what that looks like and bringing that into the space, I feel like I don't necessarily know that it would have completely changed the conversation, but it might have added another factor of, well, at the next session, because he gave a couple recommendations like, well,
Yeah.
we should make another session and it should be these people in the space, and we should make a session and it should be these people in the space.
Yeah.
And I think there could have been room for another recommendation of like what Aponte maybe would have considered beneficial and more helpful than hurtful, like what kind of father figures and how to structure the like therapy sessions with that, because even I'm questioning like, well, maybe don't bring all the ex-husbands into your room at the same time, but there probably
You could
would be
start
an
by
approach that I would
steps.
imagine
Yeah.
can bring those father figures into the space as well and get sort of at least a layout of how they feel they directly interact with
Yeah,
Melanie.
because they have a different perspective, and so it's all about finding all the other perspectives to change those patterns. So they might offer some different insight that we just don't know that could lead to something else for that.
Can I interject? Because I have like a very different perspective.
Yeah.
So I think that the one that my understanding is that there was a significant what's the word, contempt that I used earlier towards the brother.
Yes.
His issues.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that my knowing of children is that when they're in that environment, so even in that space, how they were projecting that contempt into that space was shutting down the little girl. And so by addressing that and creating some boundaries for the adults around how they're engaging with that, to keep it out of Melanie's space. So engaging her, if they're talking about that in front of her, that's bringing like, that's intense. Like, that's intense. They're ganging up on him, and yes, it's an issue, right? But they need some, it sounds to me like a significant shift that would be good for Melanie to give her more safety in her environment would be to choose to put some boundaries, because he lives with them, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well,
No.
But he
doesn't.
comes to the house.
right.
He'll just come to the
okay,
house.
So he's there a lot, is what I'm saying, and there's big conflict.
I don't really know if he's there a lot.
Even the fact that he's simply there, though, I think it's
I
creating
thought,
conflict.
well, either way, like it's a big distressing. So if you're a little person and there's this huge
Yeah, that's a good point.
conflict of this person coming into your space, I'm guessing every time the brother comes around for the little girl, she's like,
Yeah.
you know, because she's not meant to have those kind of feelings in her environment yet. Like it's the adults need to process, create boundaries for that, and keep it safe for her. And so I would address that male figure before the other ones, just to create the safety and maybe even more space for the other male figures to be around. But it's clearly the women that have more effect on her at this point. And it also sounded like she's got a decent relationship no matter what with both Dad and David. And those the David thing could it could just evolve naturally, honestly, because it sounds like he's engaged. I don't know that it actually needed to be pulled out. Like it sounds like he's interested, engaged, and showing up as much as one can.
Yeah, I mean, they talk at one point about the issues that Mom and David have with together, right? Like the tensions that I think can really have an effect when it's like a young person, a young father figure has come into your life. They're relatively new. You hardly know them, so even if he's present, it might not still be easy to engage, especially for Melanie. Especially when Lori like shuts him down a lot.
Right. So another thing, like just putting that in a separate space of the little girl, like this is for you guys to deal with.
But he does talk about that theme.
And
But
I also wanted to bring up what you were saying that I think I really see, because I've experienced it, and it's really great, is the, like you were talking about reenactment, where like it maybe not in that section.
25 minutes.
Oh,
We can
there we
keep
go.
going,
I'll just,
if you want to talk.
yeah,
finish up
just I
your
think
thing.
that practicing reenactment is
Yeah.
incredible tool.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have seen it shift things, and it's just a practice. Like you're
Yeah.
practicing it. It's like, do your homework. We're going to practice this. It's going to be really awkward until it's not.
Yeah.
It's like learning another language, right? We're learning language of communication is weird and awkward.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
But that would, yeah.
Was that
All right.
everything? Did we address everything?
Yes.
We dressed it all.
Yes. Okay, let's stop this.